My next guest is talking about we are talking about a true showbiz legend, an icon, much more than just the characters that you may, or indeed the entire nation, if not the world, fell in love with, Dame Edna Everage. The Many Lives of Barry Humphries. Talks about actor, comedian, raconteur, writer, poet, artist, etc. Rowan Dean, one of Barry's friends and one of the last people to spend time with him, reminisces about the many lives. Delighted to say that. Joining us live on the line from probably the other side of the world, Rowan Dean himself. Rowan, good morning from us, presumably good evening to you.
It is indeed, Giles. Good evening from down under, as we like to say. It's summer here, and it's great to be with you.
Well, it's good to have you with us. Just tell us a little bit about how you came to know Barry.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think everyone in the world knows Barry Humphries. And one of the great things I found when I was doing the book is I'd bump into people and say, I'm writing a book about Barry Humphries. And they go, my mother-in-law was a great friend of his, or, the bloke next door knew him really well. And Barry was the sort of guy who collected friends. He collected people. I was lucky to be one such collection along the line. I'm the editor of The Spectator Australia, which is a magazine, and Barry has a strong connection with that magazine. So we sort of came into each other's orbits through that. But I was very, very lucky to spend quite a bit of time with him recently in the years leading up, sadly, to his death. In fact, I was with him for an hour or so, only a couple of days before he died in hospital. And literally, Giles, it was like a one-man Dame Edna performance. All the gags were there, all the humor was there, all the characters were there. He was 89, only a few days away from tragically passing away, but he was still cracking jokes about the Irish nurses down the corridor, and it was full-on Celeste Patterson. But I got to know him basically through mutual friends, and we had spent lunches and dinners and times together. But at one time, Giles, classic Barry Humphries, he came striding up to me in about 2021 going, Rowan, let me give you COVID, and flung his arms around me. And he was true to his word, Giles. He was true to his word. The next day I got a message, by the way, I tested positive. So there you go. There's a little bit of Barry Humphries' DNA floating around in there somewhere.
The thing with Barry is the fact that he's, because in the UK, there is a rich tradition of men dressing up as women, drag, old school drag, I'm thinking Dan Leary, etc. But Barry was, and correct me if I'm wrong here, he was one of that generation of Australians who came over to the UK in the 50s and 60s and sort of had alternative comedy and were part of, I'm thinking sort of Clive James coming over as well, and that rich sort of vein that set themselves up in the UK in London when that was the week that was, and that sort of anti-establishment really great humour.
Giles, that's 100% correct. He was great mates with Clive James, Germaine Greer. There was a whole group of them. They were called the Sydney Push. They sort of came over, arty crowd. There were painters, there were artists, writers. They got into that whole counterculture thing. Barry Humphries became great mates with Peter Cook, of course, and that led to Barry writing The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie for Private Eye, the counterculture 1960s magazine, and it was so outrageous and it was so out there. The Adventures of Barry, the cartoon strip is so completely the Me Too generation would die even opening at any given page. But from there he went on. And he got involved in movies. He appeared in a couple of little movies and things. But the friendship with Peter Cook was very, very pivotal. And Peter Cook encouraged him. He could see Barry's great comedic strengths. And Barry launched, people kind of think Dame Edna appeared in the 70s or 80s or even 90s in America. Certainly in London in the 80s, Dame Edna, the Night with Dame Edna and Evenings Intercourse with Dame Edna, all that sort of stuff was classic 80s stuff. But he'd been around since the late 50s and early 60s. And Barry had been refining this character, Edna Everage. She was a sort of boring little housewife. The British equivalent would have been someone from Coronation Street or whatever. She was a suburban mum, couldn't cope with this kind of 60s sexual counter-revolution. That was her. But she evolved and grew. So by the time she evolved the personality after many failures, Dame Edna failed frequently on the stage in America and even in Britain before finally taking off. But wow, when Dame Edna took off, Dame Edna really took off.
Because it against the background of Mary Whitehouse, who was the family campaigner in the UK and she had the glasses down. But that's right. You know, that suburban Australian housewife and the accent. I mean, absolutely. Because to be honest with you, a lot of people in the UK don't know. I mean, this is pre-Neighbours, people. So that, I mean, a lot of people were catapulted into the Australian hinterland like you were when Neighbours came out in the 80s. So during that run-up, it was a sort of, the fact that people got it was quite, but it just goes to show the brilliance of the writing and the character rather than having to have a background on that. But I'm not surprised that the Americans didn't get it to begin with, because obviously you need to bring a certain amount to the party to actually get Dame Edna.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the characters I spoke to, so my book is a series of interviews with different people who knew at different stages and brings out these different things. One of the interviews in the book is with the person who attended the very, very first Dame Edna Broadway appearance, off-Broadway, of course, in New York. And it was a complete flop. The evening was a complete disaster. And there's Barry Humphries trotting around the stage. No one could work out if he was a man or a woman or what he was going. He was throwing flowers around, and people just sat there stony-faced, not having the faintest idea what was going on. But from then, fast forward a decade later, and Dame Edna took Hollywood by storm, had one of the great TV shows. And literally, Giles, what is fascinating is the celebrities would queue up to be humiliated by Dame Edna. There's never been anything like it.
Yeah, but you see, this is the point. This is one of my things about I don't know, to say Barry was a comic is belittling, but the humour of that generation, A, it asked for a certain amount of intelligence and not to be offended, but B, it's not the theatre of the cruel. Okay, so if Barry Humphries gets you on, he may rip the proverbial out of you, but it's done in good humour rather than an attack. Because you can attack, and you see comics do that, and they attack the subject once, and then that comic that guest would never come back on. But with Barry Humphries, or with the Dame, he could say outrageous things in good humour and get away with it, and they would come back.
They would queue up. I mean, whether it was Prince Charles and Camilla being laughed at. There's a great sketch where literally Dame Edna turns up in the royal box with Prince Charles and Camilla and sits there. And then a few seconds later says, oh, they found me a better seat. As you say, I mean, the classic put down, but no one is offended, and Prince Charles is roaring with laughter. But that Hollywood literally could not. There was great scenes in his shows where, you know, a famous actor, Richard Gere, would come on, and Dame Edna would pull a lever and he'd disappear and never be seen again. That's just 2 seconds on the show. So all sorts of fun. But he was what the book tries to focus on, Giles, is all of that, all the great Dame Edna and all the celebs. But I've tried to weave through much of the other sides of his personality. Yeah. This is the kind of idea of the Renaissance man. And the Renaissance man, you know, the idea of a polymath, of someone who is not only a great writer, a great actor, he was also a great artist. He was also a great musician. He was a great collector of books. He had this passion for music from the Weimar Republic, which he literally brought back to life. There were these collection of terrific classical musicians, kind of cabaret musicians from the Weimar period, many of them whom were killed in the Holocaust, and Barry literally brought them back to life by getting the music, the scoring of the music, bringing it onto Broadway, bringing it into London to the South Bank. And I mean, what an extraordinary person. I'm
just seeing an Oxford and Cambridge entrance exam discuss the links between the Weimar Republic's music and Dame Edna average discuss, because that exactly. Is a link. But again, it goes back to that thing with, because he was intelligent and because he was multi-talented, he wasn't that cliched, you know, the sad clown, you know, the comic who was brilliant on stage and then weeps behind. I mean, he had a full and it wasn't just he dabbled in painting. You know, he was a proper painter, wasn't he?
Terrific painter, and he would spend his holidays with other famous artists down, like they used to do in the kind of 20s or 30s, go off to a beachside place and paint all the little, ponds and landscapes. He was passionate about landscapes. He was passionate. He would turn up, Giles, and some of these things I knew nothing about till I started writing the book. But for instance, he had a real passion for the Australian outback, and he would turn up and do a Dame Edna show in these ultra remote communities, miles from anywhere, literally miles from anywhere. There'd be a small Aboriginal community there. They had no idea. The women loved Dame Edna. They thought he was the funniest. She was the funniest thing ever. And he would turn up at these strange places, little pubs and things, and do these routines, even though he was a Hollywood superstar. He had this passion for the outback as well. So there's so many little stories and things about this man who was so unique.
And also he was able to divorce himself from those parts. It wasn't, I said a bit off air, my uncle, who was a journalist, interviewed Barry on several occasions, and he always referred to, apart from being a great lunch companion, quote unquote. Yeah, exactly.
I can vouch for that,
absolutely.
Giles. I can vouch for that.
This is the 70s and 80s journalism. Trust me, it's different. But he would say that he was different. So he would refer to Edna as the Dame, and you would always ask, you would always address Edna as the Dame. It wasn't like, oh, can you slip into that? And can you slip into something? He absolutely knew to do, it'd be a bit like asking the actor to do, Patrick Stewart to do Jean-Luc Picard. It's not, he understood that was a role.
It very much so. And in fact, a couple of the stories that I've written about in the book, one which is just great, is that Dame Edna and Joan Rivers were sort of, I think it was the Queen's Jubilee or something like that they were, they were reporting on, they were there. And the TV personality from Australia who went over and organised the whole thing was watching, and he was chatting to Barry in the changing room. And literally as the dress and the bra and the wig came on, the entire personality, the voice, everything changed. And suddenly there was Dame Edna. And another great, and Barry took Dame Edna so seriously. There was another time which their equivalent of the BAFTAs in Australia are called the Logies, and there are these big TV awards. And Barry Humphries, or rather Dame Edna, was presenting the awards to various characters, and there was some American comedian or something who'd won a prize, and he got up and Dame Edna gave him a kiss because he'd won. And this comedian said on national TV in front of everybody, that's the first time I've been kissed by a man on live TV or something like that. And Barry Humphries was livid. He went completely blank, and the cameras faded, and they walked off the stage. And my friend of mine was telling me he started shaking, and he turned around to this one particular comedian who said, "You have just effed up 2 decades of my work, you bastard. I am not a man." So there you go. He took it seriously.
And so so Les, was that yes. Was that the pendulum? Was that from, was that the, if you like, the dark side, the dark side, Luke, of Edna? Because that is, when he arrived, it was just like wonderful. But perhaps he had to, presumably based on observations, but not being a caricature, perhaps, because otherwise he could have offended his fan base.
Well, you're spot on there, Giles, because in fact, Celeste was invented, and again, this story is in the book. Celeste was invented one night when Barry turned up at one of these, what we call here, leagues clubs. They're like working men's clubs of the 50s or 60s in Britain, but this leagues club way out in working class suburbs, western suburbs of Sydney. And Dame Edna turned up in the frock and all of that, and the promoter looked aghast. This is back in the 70s, and said, "You can't go on like that. You got to have a bloke to introduce her at least." So Barry Humphries quickly knocked up. He'd spotted a guy in the audience, and he thought, "I'll just copy him." And I hate to tell you, this will come as a shock to you, Giles, but there are many, many Celestes in Australia.
No.
There are many. I know you don't believe me.
I know, please.
And anyway, so he came out as this character, and he introduced Dame Edna via Sir Les. He was just plain old Les back then, and they loved him. And the fascinating thing is several people, when Celeste started to become a part of Dame Edna's act in the late 70s, they're literally stories of people who had no idea it was the same person, had no idea. They thought and this is what a great actor he was, as well as a great writer.
Yeah.
They literally had no idea it was the same person.
Away from the spotlight, we said a great lunch companion. I mean, did he obviously, he was a cultured man. He had the collections. He did the art. I mean, I can't recall anything political. I mean, okay, he's writing with satirical magazines, and those great magazines as well. But I don't remember him sort of attaching himself to a cause per se. Was that just not was he of that generation that he wouldn't get involved because he knew that he was doing?
You're spot on there, Giles, and that's a great observation. And he was like a lot of actors from that time. They were very careful not to get too involved with politics. They didn't want to be associated with one side or the other. But part of what I do explore in the book is how he did transform. He did move across the political spectrum from quite, classic, arts, 1970s leftist types to quite a more conservative minded by the time he died. Now, he didn't like labels. He didn't like that, but he was vehemently opposed to the whole kind of woke agenda, very much like Ricky Gervais. I mean, a very similar sort of approach. Comedians have to laugh at stuff. And if they're not allowed to laugh at something, that drives them nuts. And so Barry was always one about pricking pomposity. So when pomposity was on the right, he would prick the right. When pomposity was on the left, he would prick the left. But he did try to avoid being political. But nonetheless, as a conversationalist, many of his friends were quite political, and he would love to have political discussions over lunch or at dinner or whatever. It fascinated him, but it was also more comedy for his, grist to his mill.
Just because we've mentioned this word has come up quite in the 20 minutes we've been speaking, but lunch and dining comes up a lot. So what was a lunch with Barry like? Because you survived. Was it a good old fashioned? Was the good old fashioned? Yeah, go.
Well, he didn't drink, so he was teetotal. He was an alcoholic in the 60s and 70s, so he gave up drinking in the 70s. And he always did that, AA thing. I'm an alcoholic, but I don't drink, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But at a lunchtime event or a dinner event, he was hilarious. He was the center of the room. He always had to have a stage to perform on. So if you were just two people in a restaurant, or if, as I said, you were in a hospital ward, or if you were at a big lunch or a big party with 20 or 30 or even 100 people there, Barry was center stage. He was always entertaining. He was always cracking jokes. And his timing was so good. He would crack a joke or make some observation to you, and you thought, wow, he's so sharp. He just picked that up like that. And then I'd find out later as I was researching the book that a dozen other people had exactly the same gag sprung on them at whatever time. So he was the consummate entertainer, loved being the center of attention, but also, and this is what's separated him from so many celebrities and I guess, stars or whatever you want to call them, he was fascinated by you. So, Giles, if he was sitting here with you now, at least 10 minutes or 20 minutes would be finding out what you thought about X, Y, and Z, observing you, picking out your peccadillos and saying, well, what about this? Or what do you think about this? So he was fascinated. He collected human foibles. He collected human anecdotes. He collected the way people behave, and he would draw that in and he would use it. And many is the time, again, the anecdotes that I picked up from people, they would be at a dinner party and someone or other would say something, and sure enough, 3 or 4 nights later on Broadway, there's that exact scene being talked about on stage.
It's all material. But the thing is,
exactly,
as well, people obviously, because it is a treasury of reminiscences, that's the subheader, but people want to speak about Barry. People, it's not like, oh, that dreadful man, because it seems that everybody who he's come into contact has a Barry's Humphries tale.
Absolutely. And that was the extraordinary. Since I finished the book, I've then bumped into a few other people and said, oh, did I tell you that I knew Barry? Or I met Barry? So, you could do 3 more volumes. But the point is, he was fascinated by people. He just loved people. He loved the crowd. Now, there's a great story, Giles, that during COVID, that Kathy Lett told me, that during COVID, when people were applauding the nurses and the NHS people walking up and down the street, I don't know if the people in London apparently were out in the streets clapping and applauding, Barry would go out and stand on his balcony with his arms out to soak up the applause and say to Kathy, this is more like it, this is more like it. I've been missed it so much.
and it wasn't expected. I mean, he passed very quickly. And I think that was a big shock for a lot of people. And Barry would have been touched, wouldn't he? Because the outpouring that came when we suddenly realized that we'd lost him was quite something around the world.
It was a big shock for him, Giles. I can tell you that. He was not intending on going. And we were actually he was due to speak at a spectator function that I had a couple of days before he died, and he was due to speak there. And he was determined to be there. And as far as he was concerned, he was in great health and he would be out of hospital soon. It was a tragic story. It began with a fall and a hip, and then it developed into something else. And he died very quickly, and, he wasn't lingering in pain for a long time. Which was great. But as you say, there were people in Australia who weren't sure how, because Australia was always quite schizophrenic about Barry Humphries. A lot of Australians loved him. A lot of people thought, particularly in the 60s and 70s, he's giving us a bad name, He's making us look like, a bunch of drunken, lecherous, yahoos.
Imagine the very shame.
I know, exactly. Can you think how that could happen? But he was. There had been some controversies as well. He was cancelled by the very festival, the Melbourne Comedy Festival, which he himself established with Peter Cook. He was cancelled from that a couple of years ago, and they even cancelled the name of the Barrys, which were the #1 awards, because of comments he'd made about transgenderism. So there was a lot of, antipathy towards him in many circles, particularly the woke circles. And so no one was really sure what would happen. Would people not even really notice that he died? Would people, be kind of, another guy from the 70s, whatever. But it was the opposite. As you said, the outpouring of emotion was unbelievable. Literally people in the streets, it's all they were talking about for a couple of days. Every show, every radio show, every politician of every stripe, people were pouring out. I was lucky to be able to do a tribute. I did a film tribute, which I did through Sky, and it was just an extraordinary. Australia just went, yes, he's our son and our daughter, and much more besides.
What do you hope that people will take from The Many Lives of Barry Humphries?
Well, basically just the sheer brilliance of the guy on so many levels. We know the gags, and I've got all the gags in there, and they're terrific, and you read them again and you just laugh and you just think that's great. But I also wanted to get these particular stories about his love and passion for all the different arts of painting, sitting there painting, of people who are inspired by him, and people in the outback, and actors and writers. And Geoffrey Rush was in the book. He owes his he talks about his acting career and how much he owed to Barry. Some of our great comedians from Australia are in the book and talking about how they first were inspired by Barry when they were, little kids and so on. So it rounds out the character, and there are so many interesting anecdotes that, complement Soles and Dame Edna, and in some ways explain them. And I spoke to his sister and about him growing up, and again, the stories of him entertaining her as a little girl. Just fantastic stuff. So I hope people enjoy it and just enjoy the character.
The book is called The Many Lives of Barry Humphries, a Treasury of Reminisces. It's by Rowan Dean, who we're speaking to today. Rowan, if people want to track you down in the nicest possible way on the internet, where's the best place to find you?
You can find me at rowandean.com.au, or you can order the book from michaelwilkinsonpublishing.com.au. I also appear on Sky News, The Outsiders, and on Twitter at Rowan Dean.
And you'll also be able to download the book from our own, or order the book via our own virtual bookstore.
Even better.
On TRE. There you go. Cut out the middleman. This book is called The Many Lives of Barry Humphries. It's by Rowan Dean. Rowan, it's been an absolute blast to speak to you today.
Thanks, Giles. Thanks, mate.